Ecce Rome. Ecce Rome. Ecce Rome. Behold Rome. That's what they say to visitors here, though the one who says it is usually not, like me, a prisoner in a dungeon, but one of the coach drivers, let's say, who's just paused at the brow of a hill and is pointing with his whip at the bronze gods and marble statues of this proud city. Oh, it isn't merely a city, of course, but the living heart of a great empire stretching from Britain to the Black Sea, presided over just now by a temperamental young man who, when he's not playing women's parts on the stage, plays the greater part of world ruler, the Emperor Claudius Caesar Nero. Without knowing it, he also plays the part of Antichrist. 3 years ago, a great fire swept through the city, and fearing he'd be blamed for lack of preparedness, the emperor spread the vicious lie that the Christians had conspired to set Rome aflame and began a furious persecution. I confess I've set some fires myself. Fires that I hope will last. Fires of the Spirit. Ecce Rome. I beheld Rome, beheld it in its majesty and its cruelty and in its breathtaking beauty, which is everywhere. Still, I cared less for the silent grandeur of the temples and towers of men than for the living voices of creation. The wind whistling in the hilltop pines at sunset, the nightingales singing on the Quirinal, the voices of the children at their games shouting in their melodious Latin. I like to think those bright-eyed sons and daughters of the pagan world would turn the fountains of Rome into the fonts of baptism and echo in a great chorus the reverent words of the Roman centurion. Domine non sum dignus. Lord, I am not worthy. Sed tantum dic verbo, but only say the word. Oh yes, I saw and felt Rome. What it was and what it might become. I lived in my own house during my early days here, for though I was technically a prisoner, my guards sometimes permitted me to stroll through the busy streets as they pointed out the houses of the great, the monuments of the heroes. I was, after all, a Roman citizen, not yet convicted of any crime, and my guards seemed to think that if only I could learn to love Rome as they did and confess that the emperor was divine, I would thereby save myself. I'm afraid in my case, the seed fell on stony soil. Divine? With those curls? I simply couldn't see it. What can I say? I lack imagination. Nowadays, I witness nothing of the city except up there where through a small break in the wall I can make out a part of a Doric column. When the sun is up, that is. Just now, it's still very dark, and I suspect there's an hour or so before the dawn. I have a special reason for watching for it this summer morning. It will be my last. At first light, an escort of the Praetorian Guard will lead me outside the city walls, along the cobblestones of the Via Ostiensis, past the Pyramid of Cestius, and to the third milestone, where we'll turn down a side road and march a short distance to a place called Aquiae Salvae. And there, at the foot of a pine wood that rises gracefully up into the low hills, I'll be tied to a stake, stripped, given a bloody scourging, and beheaded. I can only say, at last, my joy could not be greater. To live is Christ, and to die is gain. It was once very different with me. Long before I was put in prison for the crime of believing that Jesus is the Messiah, I knew what it was to put others there. Though I was to convert many doubters by the grace of the Lord, let me assure you there was no doubter so hard to convince as myself. I had all of the arrogance of a young scholar steeped in Greek and Hebrew learning, and the pride of place that goes with fortunate birth. I was called Shaul, after the first king of Israel, and a king I liked to think myself. I was Saul of Tarsus, a citizen of no mean city, as I like to say, for Tarsus had done Rome great service, and in gratitude, Rome had bestowed the gift of citizenship to any born inside the Tarsus walls. That was why, Hebrew of the Hebrews though I was, and proud of it, I could claim the same privileges under the Roman law as the most august Roman senator. And much later, I was to do just that. Tarsus was a flourishing and cosmopolitan center of trade, with a great university and temples and public buildings overflowing with beautifully wrought idols and mosaics. And yet the two idols I remember best were those that flanked the city's entrance gates. On the one side stood a marble statue of Sardanapalus, the city's founder and officially a god. On his pedestal was carved the Epicurean motto, "Eat, drink, enjoy thyself. The rest is nothing." On the other side stood a statue of Queen Semiramis, the Assyrian Venus. I'm sure those two never looked more triumphant than the day when Cleopatra's royal barge raced up the Cydnus River with its purple sails and silver oars, bearing the queen to our city, where she might briefly share the bed of the Roman general, Mark Antony. Eat, drink, enjoy thyself. The rest is nothing. My parents knew of better things, and when I was of an age, arranged for me to continue my studies in that city of all cities, Jerusalem. Yerushalayim. Here were no pagan shrines or pleasure palaces where men turned themselves into swine, but the living stones of spiritual destiny. Its very breezes seemed to carry the voices of David and Solomon, the thunderings of Isaiah, the still small voice of the Eternal. I loved its fanatic, uncompromising spirit, its contempt for Rome, its arrogant delight in thinking itself the one true capital of the earth. It was more than history. It was meaning. It was a regal self-righteousness. It was a mighty intolerance. It was myself. I sat at the feet of the great Gamaliel. a Pharisee to whom I would be a spiritual son, perpetually curious, perpetually learning. The law, the law, the law, the 10 great commandments, the criminal code, the rules of liturgy and sacrifice, eating and washing, harvest and gleaning, bond and free. It left out nothing. It answered everything. And never could I have believed that it was only a schoolmaster to teach us our inadequacy and lead us to Messiah. I chanted it in Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic day after day, year after year, until its phrases and rhythms were as much a part of me as my toes and fingers. If there were justification by the law, I would have found it. Not that I was so taken up with it that I abandoned my Greek and Roman learning, for I did not. Hebrew of the Hebrews, though I was born, bred, and circumcised, I was as facile at quoting Aratus the Stoic as Jeremiah the prophet. In Tarsus, I'd already acquired a Greek name, as was the custom of Jews living in Hellenic lands, for, as I say, in Hebrew my name is Shaul, but since in Greek Saulos suggests a disciple of Bacchus, and as you may know, I take wine only for the stomach's sake, I took the more Roman-sounding Paulus instead. Altogether, then, I thought of myself as sophisticated, cultured, cosmopolitan, but in truth I was a narrow and violent man, loving the law, but hating its enemies, and that was why, when the time came, I so eagerly went out with a knife in my teeth against the believers. Believe me, after all of those years of study, I thirsted for action, and there was nothing I enjoyed more than leading my little expeditions, rounding up all of the cross followers I could find and delivering them like so many trussed-up bandits to the local magistrates. I was righteous. I was relentless. I spread terror left and right. I was hell on earth. And it never occurred to me for a moment that I was anything less than truth on horseback. What a sense of accomplishment it gave me. I was, after all, an intensely practical man. I loved learning, of course, for that was power, but I also found great joy working with my hands, creating something tangible. By trade, I was a tent maker. You see, we Jews, even doctors of the law, don't scorn manual labor the way the Greeks and Romans do. No. We celebrate it. The great Rabbi Hillel was a carpenter. The famous Rabbi Yitzchak was a blacksmith. So I was proud to be a tent maker. My parents had a workshop, and the hills around Tarsus abounded with mountain goats whose thick, shaggy coats could be woven into cloth well suited for cloaks and tents and carpets. So it was the most natural thing in the world that I would learn that useful trade. Many were the herdsmen in those days, sleeping in tents that I had made with my own rough and calloused hands. And much later, many of the Christians, sleeping by rats in filthy prisons, for I had tied them up and put them there with my tent maker's rope. The Christians, that is, not the rats. For the Christians, as I saw it, were far more dangerous. I promise you, I shed no tears at those little scenes of accusation and arrest. I wanted those people silenced. I simply couldn't stand the thought of them talking of God and the Messiah as though they knew more than the doctors of the law, or let me bring it closer to home, as though they knew more than I did. And yet here were all of these little chirping Christian sparrows proclaiming all was well, how their anointed one had somehow conquered sin, death, and even the Roman eagle by getting himself hammered to a pine cross, dying the death of a criminal. Believe me, that was not how we defined triumph in Jerusalem. And yet there was one Jewish Christian who I in no way could characterize as a sparrow. He was too bright, too bold, too eloquent. I mean the young deacon, Stephen. And here was no ignorant fisherman or shopkeeper, but a remarkably forthright young man with the face of an angel and the authority of a prophet. He was all anyone was talking about for a while back then, every day performing wonders, multiplying disciples, even convincing some of our devout Levites. No wonder the Sanhedrin finally put him on trial for blasphemy. It was the only way to shut him up. And when the trial was held, it was held in the open air by the gate near the Temple Hill, which gave it something of the flavor of a combat in an amphitheater. And our infallible defenders of the infallible law soon found they had a lion by the tail. But when the high priest asked Stephen if in fact the late Jesus of Nazareth had not advocated changing the unchangeable law of Moses, Stephen answered by quoting those parts of Jewish history, the story of Joseph and his murderous brothers, for example, to use as a mirror to show his judges how clearly they resembled those Hebrews of an earlier day who had resisted the Lord and persecuted the prophets. You should have seen their brows furrow and their suspicions mount. Was this young lion telling them that had they lived in an earlier day, they would have been not the law's defenders, but its enemies? He left no doubt about it. Or I should say, the Holy Spirit of God, speaking through Stephen, left no doubt. You stiff-necked and uncircumcised of hearts and ears. You always resist the Holy Spirit. What your fathers did, so did you. Which of the prophets have not your fathers persecuted? And they have killed them who prophesied the coming of the Just One, of whom you now have yourselves been the betrayers and the murderers. Yes, you! Who have received the law by the disposition of angels and have not kept it. You can imagine their response to that, the impudence, the pride, the blasphemy, but worst of all, the truth. And yet, somehow with that seraph-like face of his gazing up into the blue sky, Stephen was able to compel their silence long enough to say, "Behold, I see the heavens opened, and the Son of Man standing by the right hand of God." Well, the howl of rage that went up at that, believe me, it could be heard all the way to the Mount of Olives. And the roar of the crowd continued all the way out to the place of stoning. Although he was struck again and again, Stephen seemed untouched. His eyes were the eyes of a man who has seen the glory and rejoices that his hour has come. How do I know? I was there, tremendously excited by the mood of blood and rage, and yes, it was at my feet that the very witnesses who'd lied at his trial piled their garments so as not to get them bloody. And Saul was consenting to Stephen's death. I should say I was. And not merely that, I was delighted, affirmed, renewed, justified. It was only much later that I came to realize that even as we thought we were executing a blasphemer, we were heaping glory on the head of the first Christian martyr, and that even as the stones flew and Stephen prayed for our forgiveness, even then the torch was being passed from his hand to mine. For soon it would be I who would be speaking on behalf of the Son of Man before the councils and the synagogues. I who would be persecuted and stoned. I who would be walking down the same road on which, in the eternal distance, the figure of Stephen would beckon forever. But of all of that, I knew nothing just then. I only knew we'd killed our enemy's shining young champion, and we must see to it that another champion did not rise to take his place. Indeed, I couldn't wait to lead the charge. I went to the Sanhedrin, reminded them I'd already had some success in rounding up Christians, and explained to them my ideas for setting up a network of terror, and volunteered my services to lead the far-reaching campaign that I urged them to wage. And when they saw that, young though I might be, I was a man of force and purpose, they were delighted to furnish me with the arms and the men and the documents that I needed. And there I was, as was so truly said of me, breathing out threatenings and slaughter, making sure that wherever the new faith went, the sword of the pursuer would soon follow. And that was what in time caused me to set out with a company of armed men on the road to Damascus, that silver spoon on green velvet, as someone has called it, that city waiting for me at the end of the journey that would change my life forever. It was 150 miles as the crow flies, but the way was by no means direct. In fact, it was an 8 days journey that followed a dusty caravan route north through Galilee, around Mount Hermon, and across the dry plains. And a difficult journey it was, what with my haste and impatience, the sore-footed animals, and the terrible heat of high summer. But when at last the city drew near, the sun was fierce and the dust thick, but I rejoiced to see in the far distance the faint outline of the city, and I had just paused to point it out to one of my men when suddenly everything became very still, and I found myself gazing up into a pure and dazzling light. And even as I watched the secret door of the universe open wide, the strength went out of my legs and the sight from my eyes, and I fell to the ground, feeble and terrified, and wondering if I was still a part of the present world. And then I heard a voice, serene and majestic, but with the tone of a father dismayed by a willful child. Shaul, Shaul, lama tirdophani. Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Now this was the strangest thing, for though I still officially believed it could only be the God of Moses, there being, as I knew no other, I asked, "Who are you, Lord?" "I am Jesus whom you persecute. It is hard for you to kick against the goad." Well, there it was, the terrible truth, the truth I'd fought against, the truth that all of those imprisoned victims of mine had been right to accept, the truth that had brought me to my knees, the truth of the one who had said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. I was astonished. I was ashamed. I was terrified. I was trembling, but even then, I knew that I was being called, and that, wrong and wicked though I had been, I would have my part to play in the colossal drama that had begun to unfold on a cross in Jerusalem. Lord, I said, what would you have me to do? Arise, go into the city. There it will be told to you what you must do. And that was all. The whole experience was over in the twinkling of an eye. Indeed, my men were almost as astonished as I was, and wondered what strange god or sorcerer had chosen this lonely path to address me in mysterious and disembodied words and leave me blind as a stone. And yet they took good care of me. They led me by the hand into Damascus to the house of a certain Judas on what the Romans called the Vicus Rectus. A very fitting name, the street called Straight, for straight would the Lord make my path from that point on. And for 3 days I saw nothing, I touched no food or drink, but finally a man named Ananias came to me and laid hands on me and became the channel through which my sight was restored. And when that vision came to pass, I was as overjoyed as Ananias was mystified. Lord, he said, I have heard what great evil this man has done to your saints in Jerusalem. He had heard correctly, but the Lord responded, go your way, for he is a chosen vessel unto me. For he will bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. And I will show him what great things he must suffer for my name's sake. A chosen vessel. That's what I was. I hadn't chosen him. He had chosen me. And into the vessel of my being, he would pour his Spirit. And his Spirit would lead me to do great things in bearing his name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. I, who had been an instrument of destruction, would now become a vessel of grace and truth. A mighty work was beginning. And so, I confessed my faith and was baptized. For 2 years, I stayed in Damascus, passionately preaching the truth I tried so passionately hard to destroy, sometimes retiring to the desert to fast and pray and be taught of the Lord the mysteries of faith. I certify that the gospel that was preached of me is not after men, but I was taught it by the revelation of Jesus Christ. I could never stress that enough. I wanted it down in writing for believers in time to come, to know that I wasn't simply offering opinions after the manner of some philosopher, but speaking as the Lord's own instrument in the Lord's own pure words, like silver tried in a furnace of earth, purified 7 times. Out there in a great solitude with the jackals and hawks and the blue sky of eternity, I was taught of the Lord the deep things I would later teach in the cities of men. Redemption, grace, the spiritual gifts, justification by faith, all these things I learned as the Lord talked with me as I knelt in my tent and prayed, or else simply walked along beneath the desert stars. Truly, I was a chosen vessel, for I had the unspeakable privilege of having the truth poured into me by truth himself. Meanwhile, in Damascus, some of the Jewish leaders were finding me increasingly insufferable, for all too often I was pointing out to them the infallible truths that the Lord had shown me. Besides, having heard from Jerusalem that I'd abandoned my noble calling as Christian hunter, they considered me a traitor and lusted to see me in the grave. When word at last reached me that there were assassins lying in wait, I had to escape under the cover of darkness, lowered 40 feet to the ground outside the city walls in a makeshift basket. Does that sound undignified? Well, it was never meant to be easy to be a fool for Christ and a spectacle to the world. Following my escape, I returned to Jerusalem, and there I spent 15 days telling the apostles all that the Lord had taught me and debating in the synagogues. Some of the Christians, alas, did not believe that the Christian hunter of old had become, like Peter, a fisher of men, and it took all of the efforts of my good friend Barnabas to persuade them otherwise. The Sanhedrin, however, was considerably less willing to forgive and forget, and once again, I became the target of assassins. Well, this time the believers thought it prudent to give me an escort to Caesarea and place me on a ship bound for my home city of Tarsus, where I would wait until such time as the Lord showed me how and in what time he would best use me. Well, it seems that the Lord was prepared to wait, for I stayed in Tarsus almost 10 years. Oh, there were times that I longed to be like the friends of my youth, happily married with their children like olive plants around the table, but I knew that the Lord had called me to a life of danger and travel where no wife or children could follow, and so I put aside my envy, my thoughts of what might have been, that I might attend upon the Lord without distraction. I worked at my trade. I searched the scriptures with new eyes. I debated in the synagogues and lecture halls, but above all, I ripened. I learned to sit still, to listen, to reason rather than argue, to treat people the way the Lord had treated me, with patience and kindness and a side-by-side friendship that let them know that I would go the extra mile. And when the youth of 25 had at last matured to a man of 35, a door opened, and I knew that the great work of my life was about to begin. It seems that the church at Antioch had had a great deal of success making converts among the Gentiles, and not knowing how to deal with the practical difficulties involved, had placed Barnabas in charge, and he, feeling I was just the helper that he needed, journeyed all the way to Tarsus to ask me to join him. What joy I felt! There I was, a fire waiting to be ignited, and Barnabas at last struck the spark. And so I was off to that first great outpost of the church where the new faith had so mysteriously and powerfully taken hold. Antioch was the third largest city in the world. It occupied the banks of a wide river some 30 miles from the Mediterranean, and it was called the Beautiful and the Golden, a city of temples, baths, colored fountains, pleasure gardens filled with slave girls, streets paved with marble. And it was there indeed that those first followers of Messiah were called Christians. Jerusalem and Antioch, those were the two great outposts of the church in those early days, for the new faith, being confined to the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, was still a faith of the dry land and the nations of the Scripture. But all of that was soon to change, for one day the Holy Spirit, speaking through an Antioch prophet, declared that Barnabas and Paul would tread a new path, the path of the open sea. Words could not describe my joy, the honor, the sense of adventure. At last I was being given work best suited to my relentless and passionate nature, the work of a missionary. Barnabas brought along his cousin John Mark, an eager, inquisitive young man, and I must say his curiosity served him well, for he later wrote the Gospel according to Mark. But back then, he was just one of 3 excited travelers sailing down the Orontes River, the prayers and the exhortations of our fellow believers ringing in our ears, a seagoing vessel waiting for us on the coast. And when we sailed out of the harbor of Seleucus with its mulberry groves and great flocks of birds like omens of good things to come, our spirits soared within us also. For we knew now that the new faith was not just a Holy Land faith, but a faith of the whole sea-united world. As one of the poets of Rome has written, "Vain was the purpose of the god in severing the land by the estranging sea, if in spite of him our impious ships dash across depths he meant never to be touched." Well, the poet wasn't writing about us, of course, but weren't our ships dashing across depths that the gods of darkness meant never to be touched by the champions of Christianity? Who could forget it? The shouts of the sailors, the sea breeze tickling my beard, the salt spray flying, the dolphins racing past, and all the while the gospel in our hearts and a burning desire to spread it far and wide. We landed at the port city of Salamis on the island of Cyprus, its Greek temples and towers shining bright in the sunlight. But we stayed there only briefly and continued on some 200 miles to the end of that great island, to the town of Paphos, where the Roman government had its headquarters. And if I might digress for just a moment, I'd like to mention a story I often reflected upon on my travels. Homer's tale of how the great Ulysses, sailing home from the Trojan War along that same Mediterranean, was driven from one perilous adventure to another by the wrath of the sea god Neptune. We didn't have an angry Neptune to contend with, perhaps, but we did have a fierce and invisible enemy never farther from us than the air we breathed. That day, he made his influence known in Paphos through a sorcerer named Elymas. Outraged at the good impression our words were making on Sergius Paulus, the Roman deputy, Elymas spoke against us with great malice and cunning. I stood his lies for as long as I could, but then I felt the Spirit welling up inside my soul, and when I opened my mouth, out came words of fire. Oh, full of subtlety and all mischief, you child of the devil, you enemy of all righteousness. Will you not cease to pervert the right ways of the Lord? Now behold, the hand of the Lord is upon you, and you shall be blind, not seeing the sun for a long season. Well, with that, Elymas became as sightless and as helpless as I had been that day on the road to Damascus. He was stumbling around like a drunkard, shrieking with terror, begging for someone to lead him by the hand. But as for me, I rejoiced, for the whole experience made such an impression on Sergius Paulus that he exclaimed in wonder and believed our gospel. Well, great as that success was, we knew that Cyprus was merely a stepping stone, and that if we truly wanted to spread the message of salvation, we needed to sail north to Asia Minor to preach to the thriving Greek and Roman cities along the great east-west trade route. And from there, like a mighty river, the gospel could flow west to Rome and east to Jerusalem, branching off into hundreds of streams to reach every town and city in the empire, and now was the time to begin. We landed at the busy port city of Perga, but there, with the adventure of a lifetime awaiting us, we three were suddenly two. John Mark decided to return to Jerusalem, and there was no talking him out of it. Caused me the bitterest grief, and it was not until I was an old man and he in middle age that we were reconciled. But forgetting those things which are behind, and reaching forth unto those things which are before, Barnabas and I soon found ourselves striding along the wide, solid, magnificently engineered Roman road with its many layers of tar and crushed rock, a road built to last and to speed on their way all of the colorful travelers we were forever passing or who passed us. Caravans of merchants, detachments of Roman soldiers, itinerant bands of jugglers and actors, touring gladiators, the swift horsemen of the imperial post, the chariots of the wealthy. Oh, we knew nothing of luxury. We were shoe-leather apostles all the way, and we enjoyed every mile of that first gospel road that led across dry plains, through bright, flower-filled meadows, and skirted malarial swamps, and led up into mountains towards whose summits climbed great spear-like columns of pine and fir. Oh, there were the usual difficulties, the frontier dues, the road taxes, the bothersome customs officials. But what did it matter? It was the greatest road in the world. It was the road of faith. And it enabled us over many months to travel to 4 small cities chosen before the foundations of the earth to wake one day to the fullness of the kingdom. Pisidian Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. And we had our adventures in all of them, making both disciples and enemies, knowing both the joy of preaching to open hearts and the pain of persecution. For our adversaries painted us as villains dangerous not only to Judaism, but to the popular gods of the Greeks and Romans. And so, again and again, we had to move on to do what the Lord commanded. When they persecute you in one city, flee into the next. In Lystra, I was stoned with such fury that somewhere between my last prayer and my first moment of unconsciousness, I thought that the curses of my tormentors would be the last thing that I would hear in this world. But my name was Lazarus, and I lived. By the mercy of the Lord and the power of the resurrection, I was strong enough the next day to set out with Barnabas down yet another Roman road, counting the milestones and giving praise and thanks each step of the way. And so it was. After many months spent among our first 4 missionary cities, seeing that we'd accomplished all that we could on that journey, we made our way back to the coast and sailed home to Antioch. What rejoicing there was. The whole church sat applauding and questioning us as we told them how the Lord had used us as his standard bearers on the island of Cyprus and the cities of Galatia, helping us steer our way through sorcerers and stonings, the plots of assassins, the edicts of Roman officials, and the perils of robbers at wayside inns, about which I could tell many tales. But when they listened to our account of how we'd made great numbers of disciples amongst both the Jews of the synagogues and the Greeks of the pagan temples, they felt, as we felt, that soon the road of faith would extend all the way from Jerusalem to Rome. For Barnabas and I were not the only missionaries going forth. And besides, what ocean or army can stop so mighty a thing as the gospel? And meanwhile, time was passing, and I was wondering about the progress of our new churches. I wanted to return to those freshly planted vineyards of the Lord, but so did Barnabas. However, when that kindest and most forgiving man insisted once more on taking along John Mark, I said no. John Mark had put his hand to the plow, and I told Barnabas that I didn't think that spoke for the heart of a missionary. It was a terrible thing to argue with the man who'd come to Tarsus and opened the door of my missionary life, my companion of 100 dangers and adventures, but there it was. We gave each other the right hand of fellowship and pretended not to see the tears in each other's eyes and went our separate ways. Barnabas and John Mark returned to Cyprus, and I teamed up with Silas, an enthusiastic young man from Jerusalem. And together we set out to revisit those places whose names were like great bells announcing the march of the kingdom into the heart of the empire. Pisidian Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. And I rejoiced to see that the seed that Barnabas and I had planted had not merely taken root, but was flourishing like a green bay tree. Think of it. Men and women who'd spent their entire lives among the idolatries and immoralities of the pagan world, now suddenly on fire with the knowledge that they'd been chosen from all eternity to be among the world's first Christian saints. They were chosen vessels too, these new creatures in Christ, and I could have wept when I saw how hard they tried to practice the love that wins hearts and the holiness that shames the world. And I pray that they persevere even now. In Lystra, we met a young man, half Jew, half Greek, but all zeal, and we knew we'd found someone who would go the extra mile. Timothy. He could organize. He could lead. He knew his scriptures. He was like the son I'd never had, and a son he became to me. That journey also brought us another great young believer, the scholarly Luke, a physician with a penchant for history. And so there were 4 of us. And so to speak, there was even a 5th. For our original plan had been to go on preaching in the cities of Asia, but instead, guided by the Holy Spirit, we traveled a great distance along the coast to the port city of Troas, which looked westward over the Aegean Sea. And one evening, when I was at prayer in Troas, I had a vision of a man standing next to me, beseeching me, saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." That was our 5th man. And whether he was human or angel, I do not know. I only know that he seemed to be with us in all the days to come. The next day, we arose, found a ship about to sail, boarded it, and sailed westward over the blue-green Aegean into the land of Alexander the Great. As Luke later wrote in his journal, setting sail from Troas, we made a straight course to Samothrace, the day following to Neapolis, and then on to Philippi, a Roman colony. And so we preached the gospel at Philippi, the beautiful port city of Thessalonica, and the little town of Berea, where Timothy rejoined us. And where we had great success. I left Timothy and Silas to continue the work there, and I continued on alone until I reached the most celebrated city in the earth, Athens. I still remember my first sight of it as the ship moved across Phaleron Bay with the great brown hill of the Acropolis, with the white Parthenon resting on it with the airy delicacy of a bird that has just landed. But as I wandered its streets, I could see that despite its beauty, Athens was first and last a city of idols. Gods and statues on the one hand, philosophies and theories on the other. But what could I do, knowing what I knew, but to tell these original thinkers and philosophical gossips that unless one knew the truth of Jerusalem, one could never understand the truth of the cosmos. Hear, O Israel, and hear, O Athens, what is man's reason next to God's revelation? Athens is a surprisingly small place, a city of no more than 5,000 souls, and since news travels fast, word soon got round that an interesting novelty had arrived, the philosopher Polus of Jerusalem. The Stoics and the Epicureans thought I deserved a hearing, if for nothing more than my entertainment value, and arranged it with the Council of Athens. And so on the appointed day, the philosopher Polus was allowed to ascend a large rocky outcropping called the Areopagus, or in Latin, Mars Hill. And I spoke that day not only to the white-robed Council of Athens, but to a large crowd, including many wealthy young men who traveled across the empire seeking after truth. Or so they imagined. For really, even when truth seeks after us, don't most of us just make our excuses and move on? To those with open hearts, Jesus said, "You will know the truth, and the truth will make you free." To others, he might just as well have said, "You will know the truth, and the truth will make you angry. The truth will hurt your pride. The truth will make you want to persecute it." Men of Athens, I said, trying to break through their arrogance by teasing them just a bit, men of Athens, I see that in all things you're too religious. For as I've wandered your streets and observed you at your devotions, I found myself impressed most of all by the altar which bears the inscription, "To the unknown God." You must be religious indeed if you can worship a God you don't even know. Now let me help you. For this unknown God whom you worship in your devout ignorance, I'll tell you about. Well, you should have seen the ruffled feathers and the offended looks. How dare he? What audacity? Who invited this crazy fool to speak? But I kept right on going, pointing to the great Parthenon. I told them that this unknown God did not live in temples made with hands, but rather we dwelt in him. I even quoted one of their own philosophers to them, for in him we live and move and have our being. And what's more, that same God had appointed his Son, Jesus Christ, whom he has raised from the dead, to judge the world. Oh yes, I told those truth seekers so many other truths that in the end they politely applauded, made their excuses, and moved on. Even so, by the grace of God, there were some who were saved, among them Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris. Even on the rocky soil of the Areopagus, the seed could take root. But oh, that there had been more. Much later, when I wrote to the Colossian church, I was thinking of that same Athens when I set down these words. Beware lest any man trouble thee through philosophy and vain deceit, after the traditions of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ. 40 miles to the west was Corinth, unlike Athens, a new city, not so interested in arguing philosophies and theories as worshiping the gods of money and comfort. Corinth was now the center of trade between east and west, and its harbor was always filled with galleys from Spain, Phoenicia, Egypt, a dozen other lands bearing everything from spices to slaves. The word Corinthian had already entered the local vocabulary as a synonym for licentious, given to luxury. And many times over the next months, as I gazed up at the Acrocorinth, a lion-colored mountain that rose above the city, its summit crowned with the love temple of Aphrodite and its 1,000 priestesses, many times I reflected that if the gospel could take root in the polluted soil of Corinth, and it had, it could take root anywhere. Well, fortunately, I didn't have to toil alone, for shortly after my arrival, the Lord sent a great blessing my way. A young married couple, Aquila and Priscilla, Jewish believers like myself. The three of us shared a small house, became great and deep friends, rejoicing in our faith and working at our trade. Aquila was a tent maker like myself, and in a port city such as Corinth, we doubled as sailmakers and stayed very busy indeed. But I was there to preach the gospel, and that I did in that city filled with courtesans and libertines, slave girls and slave boys, love potions and immoral statues. I preached the hard and sacred truth that our bodies are not something to be played with like cards or dice, but living members of the body of Messiah, not merely houses made of flesh, but holy temples of the Holy Spirit. I made it clear that there is only one bed that is undefiled, the marriage bed. And any who practices adultery or fornication or the sin of man or woman with woman sins against his own body, the very body in which Christ himself is a guest. In Corinth, I taught three things: faith, hope, and love. Things that are, to our spirit, its air and sun and rain, and each of them, so to speak, requires movement, for faith leaps, hope climbs, and love walks beside. And the greatest of these, of course, is love. Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not love, I am as a sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries, and although I have all knowledge and all faith so that I can remove mountains, and have not love, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and give my body to be burned, and have not love, it profits nothing. Love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy, does not parade itself, is not puffed up. Love does not behave rudely, does not seek its own, is not easily provoked, thinks no evil. Love does not delight in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. For where there are prophecies, they shall fail. And where there are tongues, they shall cease. And where there is knowledge, it shall pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when that which is perfect is come, that which is in part shall pass away. When I was a child, I spoke as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. For now we see in a glass darkly, then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know even as I am known. But now abide three things: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. You must pardon me if I preach. It's an old habit, hard to break. But speaking of preaching, there came a time that we knew that we'd done all that we could in Corinth, and we needed to bring some of the same gospel light to a city that stood in desperate need of it, Ephesus. And so, accompanied by Aquila and Priscilla, I set off. For pure classical beauty, it rivaled Athens and Alexandria. And the truly difficult thing to believe, as you sailed up the canal leading in from the sea and watched Ephesus coming toward you, shining and white with the majestic red and gold temple of Diana looming up like some larger and even more magnificent Parthenon, the almost impossible thing to believe was that that city glowing with light was in fact a place of deep and terrible darkness. Oh, I know Diana's temple is one of the 7 wonders of the world, but wonders can also be horrors. And I knew from the moment that I beheld her barbaric, many-breasted statue that the new faith would have a difficult birth under the shadow of that cruel goddess. We preached the gospel, encountering resistance from every quarter. We had to overcome superstition, magic, the most fervent idolatry. Our chief enemy was a silversmith named Demetrius, who had particular reason to hate me. But you see, the most popular item the silversmiths in Ephesus manufacture is a miniature shrine to Diana that they sell at banded prices to all of the pilgrims that come each year for the festival of that goddess. And here I was, an outsider, threatening their livelihood by declaring there is only one God, and his name is not Diana. At the instigation of Demetrius, there was a terrible riot in which many people shouted, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians," as violently as they shouted for a death in the amphitheater. And seeing things could not go on as they were, the rulers of the city prevailed upon me to leave. It was time. I'd done all that I could. But when I had to say goodbye to Aquila and Priscilla and all of those whom I loved and who loved me, they wept, and I wept, for we knew until the fullness of time we'd see each other's faces no more. And so began the longest journey of my life. For whether I was on foot or in ship or in prison, I knew that I was moving inexorably toward the sword and the stake that await me outside the gates of Rome. And now my journey is almost over. And so it was, after a brief stopover in Caesarea, I found myself once more in Jerusalem, the city of peace. True, there was a terrible tumult when I arrived, and true, a band of 40 Jewish fanatics bound themselves by a terrible oath neither to eat nor drink until they killed me. I pity them. And true, I was rescued only because, as I mentioned earlier, I was born a citizen in Tarsus and was given an escort of 200 soldiers back to Caesarea. But then and always I have known the difference between human danger and the Lord's danger. For just as he'd chosen me as his vessel, I knew that he'd chosen the time and the place of my death, and it was not yet, and not in Jerusalem. Neither was it in Caesarea, where I was brought before the Roman procurator Antonius Felix, and yes, it was at Caesarea by the sea that I preached the gospel in the presence of King Herod Agrippa. For had not the Lord said that I would bear his name before the Gentiles and kings? Well, to a Roman like Felix, the charges that were brought against me seemed like a mere squabble over some obscure point of Jewish law. But no doubt to soothe the feelings of the high priest, he kept me prisoner in his palace for 2 whole years. It was a terrible time for someone of my restless nature, but at last Felix was replaced for incompetence, for failing to have kept order in Judea, and on came Porcius Festus, a kindly man who seemed inclined to get the whole business over as quickly as possible. Alas, to that end, and no doubt to soothe the feelings of the high priest, he seemed inclined to agree to a trial in Jerusalem. I became outraged that a man in his position would not know what kind of justice a ringleader of the Nazarenes could expect to find in Jerusalem, and I became so enraged I shouted out the 2 words any citizen in the empire is free to assert at any time: Caesarem appello! I appeal to Caesar. Festus had no choice. Have you appealed to Caesar? He said. Caesar, you shall go. So here I am. I've been brought before the emperor twice, and I can assure you there could be no greater distance between 2 men face to face than the Emperor Nero of Rome and the Apostle Paulus of Jerusalem and Antioch. For that Christ-hating Caesar is at last decreed that my citizenship means nothing if I would place any god above the divinity of the emperor. That is my crime, and I'm happy to be convicted of it, and to be told that my time on earth is soon to end. Time is our shipwreck, and whether we strike the rocks far out or those close to shore, strike and die we must. In truth, I know something about shipwreck, both figurative and literal. Indeed, I experienced the real thing, and not for the first time, on my way to Rome. But here was an ordeal the Lord put me through so that others now and in the future would know that there is only one God that can rescue us from the storm that is our life and years. For this was heaven speaking through every crashing wave and every gust of wind. I'd set sail from Caesarea with numerous other prisoners under the charge of a centurion named Julius, and about halfway to Rome, under the darkest skies I'd ever seen, began the fierce rain and screeching wind of what seemed like a journey through hell. And before it was over, we'd suffered horrible thirst, had been without food for 14 days, and knew what it was like to drift day after day on the open sea until our very sails seemed shrouds and our ship a coffin. And at the very worst moment, just as we were about to run aground on the rocky coast of Malta, I said to that shipload of 276, "Be of good cheer. There will be no loss of life. For tonight an angel of the Lord stood by me, saying, 'Behold, Shaul, you must be brought before the emperor, and lo, God is giving you all who sail with you.'" Do you think that that shipload of 276 soldiers, sailors, and prisoners ever forgot that word of salvation spoken to me by an angel and by me to those men who feared so desperately for their lives, for what I prophesied came true? Not a single life was lost. The Roman emperor could not save them. Diana of the Ephesians could not save them. The Stoics and the Epicureans could not save them. No power on earth could save them, but the God of shipwreck could save them, for the God of shipwreck is a God of life. He is God over the tomb of Lazarus. He is God over the tomb of Jesus. He is God over the road to Damascus. He is God over the stones that struck me at Lystra. He is God over Athens, Tarsus, Ephesus, Antioch, Corinth. He is God over Jerusalem, and he is God over Rome. And he knows our spiritual shipwreck. And he would have us to be saved. The Jews first, for we were his first love, his chosen people, and his chosen vessels. And if I, a mere man, sorrow continually and pray ceaselessly for my beloved kinsmen, having received the adoption and the glory and the covenants of promise, may yet receive the greatest gift of all, salvation, if I, a mere man, hunger and thirst for that, what must the Lord who has made us and shaped us and been our God all of these centuries, what must he feel? For he has chosen men from all nations everywhere. And by his death on the cross, salvation can be ours, provided once we've accepted it, we fight to keep it against the counsels of darkness and the temptations of the world. And about that, I would say a final word. Or I should say, repeat a final word, for it was in my last letter to Timothy, now Bishop of Ephesus, and I pray that he in his turn, and you in yours, and others in theirs, down through the generations, as the faith spreads its light, will so live as to say what I say once again. I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith. You must pardon me. I see light on the column and I hear footsteps on the high stairs. My time is at hand, and I must give thanks for this glorious day. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai